Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben. I hope you grabbed your cup of coffee or your other preferred beverage and that you brought a few Hibernate questions with you. So, before we get started, I need to check a few things. This is the first time that I'm using a tool called Restream to go live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter at the same time. And I need to quickly check that it really works. Okay, it seems to work on Facebook. We are live on Twitter and we are live on YouTube as well, I think. Yeah, seems to work. Awesome. So, yeah. Then let's dive into a few questions. If you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We should see all the messages show up here in the chat on the site, but I'm also monitoring the different social platforms and their chats. So let's see how that works out in the end. To be honest, it's a little bit confusing, but we will see. So if you're watching this, please post something in the chat so we see messages from YouTube. That works fine. I'm not exactly sure if you see my message in the YouTube chat. No, you don't. That's bad, but I see your messages. That has to be good enough for now. Okay. So there was the first question from Tanas on YouTube. How do we make Pessimistic lock efficient? To be honest, there is no way to make an optimistic lock efficient. The main issue is the lock itself. It prevents, well, if you set a pessimistic write lock, which is the worst case, then you prevent any other user from changing the record and even from reading the record. So there is no way to make that thing efficient. The only thing you can do if you want to have an efficient multi-user approach is to use optimistic locking using a version column. Okay, and I got a question about Hibernate via email. Yeah, I would check emails later and get back to you. I'm sorry, I have no clue how to pronounce your name. So I will double check my emails later and get back to you regarding that question. Or you can post it again here in the chat if you want to discuss it now live on the stream. It's probably the easiest approach. Okay. So I picked a few questions on the blog and a bunch of them on YouTube, and I will go through these questions during this stream, or at least we answer as many questions as we can within the next about 50 minutes or so. So yesterday I published a post about using Lombok with Hibernate. And a few common pitfalls you need to avoid. So in general, I'm not a huge fan of Lombok. I prefer to generate these things using my IDE. Or in case someone doesn't know Lombok, Lombok is a tool where you can add annotations to your classes, and then Lombok injects code at compile time into your classes for getter methods, setter methods, equals and hash code, constructors, these kind of boring things that we always need to provide for our Java classes. The issue is that they are not a great fit for entity classes, because there we have certain constraints provided by the JPA specification, by the Hibernate implementation. We need to take care of lazy loading and all these things. And that's why I say, okay, please don't use Lombok together with Hibernate. The different issues that occur then, I described them in more detail in the article itself. So Buster wrote very good advice. Instead of avoiding, I would recommend to be more strict and only allow for explicit included properties when using equals and hashcode, and only when appropriate into string. Also never use data on entities. Yeah, I strongly agree with that one. It can and will otherwise surprise you with a Stack Overflow at the most inconvenient time, like during a debugging session. Yeah, well, let's go up here real quick. So the issue with equals and hashcode is that Lombok, I have it somewhere here in the code, there it is, generates these methods for equals and hashcode. And the issue is that they include all attributes of that class. And that's totally fine for non-entity classes, but it's really a bad idea for entities, because entities map a database record, and a database record gets identified by its primary key and by nothing else. So we should only use the ID column or the ID attribute in the equals method. And what we should never do is use an association in our equals and hashcode method, because that will trigger a database query if that association is lazily fetched. And there are a bunch of other issues with that. So what you could do about that is you could add, well, you could set the only explicitly included attribute to true on the equals and hashcode annotation, and then explicitly include the ID attribute. Sure, you could do that. And you could do the same for toString. But do you really gain anything by putting these two annotations on your attributes and classes instead of generating the code? I would like to get your opinion on that, because I think it's just not worth the risk and hassle. But okay. Yes, you could explicitly attributes. Shall be included in your equals hash code and toString methods. But there's still a risk that you miss it somewhere, and you could easily generate these methods using your IDE. I prefer to avoid these notations. Okay, quite some messages in the chat, so let's take a look at that. Okay, Jens Schauder asks if I happen to know where in Hibernate entity graphs get applied. I have a case where the behavior changes between versions. You mean in the code, Jens? No, I don't exactly know the place in the code where that happens. It has to be somewhere where they create the database query. What kind of behavior change do you see between versions? Maybe I can help with that. And then I was asked if I have a main entity that has children. If I want to delete the entity, I put a deletion flag on true. Is there a possibility to delete all the wire flag true with Hibernate? I'm not sure if I understand the deletion flag question correctly. Is that about a soft delete where you just set a flag to hide the record instead of really deleting it from the database? Okay. Well, if you then want to really delete that record at some point, you could write a native SQL delete statement that then removes all the records where this delete flag is set to true. But then you need to handle associations yourself. So if there are child entities, you need to remove the childs first and then the parent entity and so on. But that would be the preferred approach to remove these records. Then Tanaz will ask, with optimistic locking, we will throw exception and ask again to do the same process, right? Is suggestion for this? Because at last we get this exception for most updating systems, optimistic. Yeah, so that would be the general approach. So optimistic locking uses a version column. So it's not a real locking, it's more an automated version and versioning and version check algorithm. What we do there is we annotate a column with at version, an int in most cases, and then Hibernate increments the version number for an entity with each write operation and includes a where clause in which it checks that the value of that version is still the same as the one it had when it read the data record from the database. And well, then there are always 2 points in time when you could get an exception. So Hibernate sends the update statement to the database. The database responds with the number of records it has updated with that statement, and Hibernate expects it to be 1 if you're not using JDBC badges. So the exception about the and if it's not 1, then Hibernate will throw an optimistic lock exception. So this exception can occur either at the flush, so when Hibernate sends the update statement to the database, or at the commit. The optimistic locking at the flush could be handled by your application because then you're still in control. The one that occurs during the flush will get sent to the caller and would be needed to handle it, and you need to handle it there. The common approach is just to ask the user to do retry. And in my experience, most users accept that easily, especially if you explain to them that the alternative would be that you lock the record and that they can't do anything if someone else opened the record for writing. Yeah. So then I got a question on Facebook by Mardi. Best practices with Hibernate to enhance performance. Oh, there are a bunch of them. There are a bunch of them. I explain. Well, I have a 3-day course about performance, in which I get into all the nitty-gritty details. But here is an article, and I posted there as well, in which I point out a few best practices and tips that you should always follow. So let me give you a quick rundown. First of all, you should make sure that your statements only select the data that you actually need. And by that, I not only mean only selecting records that you need to fetch from your want to fetch from your database, but also to only select the columns that you need. That's especially the case if you just use a read-only projection. So in there, I recommend to use DTO projections, where you design the DTO class for your specific use case, and then you select only the columns from the database that you actually need for that specific use case instead of just selecting a graph of entities. If you're selecting entities, then you should make sure that you initialize all associations that you need, but only the ones that you really need in your use case. So to do that, you need to use lazy fetching for all your associations and then use join fetch clauses or entity graphs to define which associations shall be initialized with your query. Then you should apply typical database optimization techniques like checking your database query, making sure that this one works well, using indices and all the database optimizations that you usually apply to a query. Then you would need to make sure that your mappings are okay, so that you use sets instead of lists for too many associations, for example, that you use the right fetch types, that you maybe use lazy fetching for blobs and clops. What else are best practices that you should follow? You should analyze if you have entities that you read very often but change only rarely. Hibernate second level cache can provide huge performance benefits. Same for queries, where Hibernate offers the query cache, which is a part of the second level cache. You should make sure to use the right strategy to generate primary keys to optimize your write operations. That would be generation type sequence, except for MySQL. They need to use auto-increment columns. Yeah, I think that's that's the quick rundown. And then the topic that we discussed a few minutes ago, you should use optimistic locking instead of pessimistic locking for your write operations. Okay, then we have a question from Raga. Provided JDBC as database layer, no other JPA framework used, can we still design an API architecture similar to JPA? Is it advisable? Well, sure, you could do that. The question is, why would you? Hibernate is a pretty old project. It's about, I would say, 20 years old. I started with one of the first versions in 2001. So yeah, it's 20, maybe 21 years old, I would guess. During that time, there was a team of developers who specialized in object relational mapping and who put a lot of effort into providing the current functionality and to make sure that it's relatively bug-free and that it's highly optimized. And well, you can't expect that you can compete with the effort and the knowledge that was put into a framework like Hibernate or Eclipse Link. At least not with a normal team that works on a customer project and actually has other things to worry about than the object relational mapping. I would always use a framework that sits on top of JDBC, and that can be several things. That could be Hibernate if you want to use JPA and an object relational mapping. That could be Juke if you want to use plain SQL and use all the features of your SQL database. Juke provides a nice Java DSL for that. Or it could be Spring Data JDBC. That's a framework where Jens Schauder, who's also here in the chat, is working on. It's an interesting approach that, I would say, sits somewhere in the middle between Hibernate or JPA and Juke, because it gives you several features of an object relational mapping framework, but much more control over the operations that you actually perform. So yeah, that might be another thing you want to take a look at. Igor, what is the best approach to define session boundaries? I mean, theoretically, it is possible to use one session in the whole application lifecycle. What is the best practice? Well, that depends on the framework stack that you're actually using. If you're using Spring or Java EE, or Jakarta EE, then you don't really have a choice. You have one session per transaction. And well, you have one session per user request, which normally means also per session. And that's a pretty good approach in general. And I wouldn't try building an application without Spring or Java EE or Jakarta EE. I would default to one of these. They're just way too useful. Jens, an entity graph basically does get ignored, although as the JPA applies it, but I can't reproduce behavior with the directly so far. I think it goes way beyond this chat, but if you want to take a look afterwards, you're very welcome. Okay. Yeah, Jens, hit me up in the in Slack, and then we can talk about that. Sounds strange. I'm not aware of any issues there. And up to now, I thought that Spring Data JPA basically doesn't anything differently to what we would do in a Java application without it. You just set the entity graph on the query, right? Yeah, let's talk about that in the chat later on and dive deep into that issue. Right, that's probably nothing that we can discuss with a few messages back and forth here. So Igor wrote Hibernate with standalone app. Well, for standalone app, I still would use probably Spring. But anyways, how would you handle a Hibernate session there? How would I handle a Hibernate session there in a standalone app? Well, it depends on how your standalone app works and what kind of operations you perform there. But I think if you don't have any reason to handle it differently, I would use the same approach as we are using in Spring or Java EE backends, and just get a new session for each request. Okay, let me quickly check that I catch all questions from the different platforms. Yeah, looks like that. Okay. Okay, Jens wrote, it's strange, it's caused by some change in Hibernate. This is pretty much all I know so far. Okay. So, Jens, are we talking about recent Hibernate versions? If I remember correctly, there were some changes in early 5 dot something versions where a few things internally changed. That might be the reason for that. But yeah, we would definitely need to dive deeper into that. Okay, let's take another look at the question here at the blog. Hi Thorben, I have a question. Why use allocation size 50? I used in my code and the ID start in 50. It's necessary in the other how to solve the generation of negative IDs. Okay, what's this article about? Mapping primary keys. It's about the sequence generator with the allocation size. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's a nice performance optimization. So if you use Hibernate sequence ID generators and have an allocation size of 50, which is the default, then you benefit from an optimization algorithm that Hibernate applies. So what they do is Hibernate knows that the sequence gets incremented in steps of 50. So it knows that after it gotten a value from the sequence, it can increment it 49 times without create any ID collision. And that's what Hibernate then does. Hibernate gets the next value from the sequence, then increments it 49 times before it gets the next value from the sequence. So you're basically removing 49 select next while statements from your application, which is great because it reduces the number of statements performed to insert 50 records into your database from 100 statements to 51, which of course is much faster. The allocation size tells Hibernate the increment size of your database sequence if it then uses it to improve the performance of your insert operations instead of requesting a new value from the sequence for each insert. Hibernate gets one from the sequence and then increments it 49 times internally. Find out more about it. I'm pretty sure I have an article for that. Let me quickly check. It's definitely part of the performance tuning course. And I mentioned it in several talks, but I think I also have an article about that. Okay, if that's the case, then it has to be in here. Sequence. Sequence there. Well, that's unfortunate. No, this is a JPA-based article. I don't mention it in there. Then this has to be enough. Okay. Okay, the change with the entity graph happened between 5.4.10 and 5.4.12. Oh, Jens, I'm sorry, I have never heard about that. Yeah, let's take a look at that after the stream, or probably a little bit later today. Okay. Okay, well, these different streams are a little bit confusing. Where is my chat? There it is. Okay. Then let's take a look at a few things on a few questions on YouTube. Okay, here I have a video about using the query annotation with Spring Data JPA, which enables you to define the query you want to execute yourself. So it's not derived from the method name, it's something that you specify using JPQL within that annotation. So how can we select few columns in query annotation and return the list of entities with only those specific columns as JSON? Not all values of entity. Well, you can't. You can only select an entity with or its attributes. If you want to select a subset, you need to use a DTO projection. Damn, I have an article about that which goes live in 2 weeks, and that would be the perfect match for this question. Until then, I can only link to the Hibernate app video about DTO. Don't have a video about DTO? Explain that in this video. It's this video. In the video, I only use Hibernate without Spring Data JPA, but you can apply the same approach using Spring. Okay, any more questions about Hibernate and so on? Feel free to paste them or to write them in the chat, and I'm doing my best to monitor the chat on all platforms. Oh, this is the right one. Okay. Then let's take a look at this one. There we have a question on Stack Overflow. Okay, how many tables with columns get created in following 4 cases? Map key enumerated, map key temporal, map key joint column. I'm new to Hibernate, just stuck in map annotation in Hibernate. When you use a map, you always need to associate at least 2 entities, right? Let's say we have an owner entity that relates to the car entity. Car has a FK to owner, so the owner will have a map of cars. The map key will give you the car's property used to group a car to its owner. For instance, if we have a VIN, vehicle identification number, property in car. Yes, exactly. So what we are doing here is we're using a map as the attribute type for the association, and then we can use that to tell Hibernate to map the list of associated entities as a map, and that means we need a key of the map. And with map key annotation, we can reference a column or an attribute of the other entity. This one down here. The map key enumerated will use an enum from car, like wheel drive. Yeah, exactly the same as above. The only difference is that it's now an attribute of type enumerated that you are referencing. Okay, now we're using map key temporal. To be honest, I haven't used map key temporal for so long that I'm not even sure if that's 100% correct. I'm having a hard time to find a real use case where using the timestamp as the key makes a lot of sense. Quite often these are strings or enums or stuff like that, which are then used as the map key. Map key join column. The map key requires a third entity like manufacturer, so that you have an association from owner to car, and car has also an association to manufacturer, so that you can group all owners' cars by manufacturer. Okay, what was the question? I need to have just a second. How many tables with columns get created in the following 4 cases? Well, it's always the same. It's 2 tables, one for the owner, one for the car. Wait a second, there was a manufacturer in the last one, so there we have 3. So case 1 to 3 get mapped to 2 database tables, owner and car. Case 4 gets mapped to 3 database tables, owner, car and manufacturer. The mapping to a map to Java util map doesn't have any impact on the table mapping. In all cases, you are mapping many to one to many association. In your table model, this gets represented by 2 database tables. The only exception is the 4th case where you have another entity that's associated, another entity and table that's associated with the car. Table, but that's not part of the actual association mapping. Sum it up. Okay, so this is code. And then I have 1, 2 links that I would like to add. So explain this mapping in great details in and that's a link. And then we add a link up here. And we post that one. Sure, done. Okay, and then I think there was another question in the chat on YouTube. Looks like the YouTube is way more active than all other platforms. So Vishal asked, is there a way to use how to handle constraint violation exceptions thrown in transaction system I'm not able to catch it inside the exception catch block inside service. Yeah, that's right. So the issue there is that when you commit the transaction, then all constraints get checked, and they get checked for the last and final time. Because when you commit the transaction, your database has to make sure that all constraints are fulfilled, so that the transaction creates a result that's consistent. And that's one of the characteristics of the asset of an asset transaction. So that happens during commit. Sometimes also happen earlier depending on how you configured the constraint, but you can be sure that it happens during commit. Then you have the problem that within your service implementation in the backend, you can't easily catch the exception. Why? Because the transaction get committed after your code, after you left the code of the method that got called by the client. So after you left the method that implemented the REST endpoint, for example. So there is no code written by you that's between the commit and the response that's sent to the client. There are two things you can do about that. You can either just accept it and make sure that it gets mapped to a reasonable and useful error message and then let the client handle it. Or the second option would be to introduce another layer into your application. So you have your REST endpoint, which is not transactional, and then you have your service layer, which then is transactional. And then you have one method in your REST endpoint and one method in your service layer that are one-to-one match. So that REST endpoint only calls this one method in your service layer and nothing else. And that method gets only called by that REST endpoint. And then you can start and end the transaction on your business layer. That means the transaction gets committed when your business layer was completed, and then you your transaction manager will commit the transaction, and you have the chance to handle and catch that exception in your REST endpoint and do something about it. Yeah, that would be the two options. The most common one is you just accept it, make sure that the exception gets mapped to a useful error message, and that's it. Is there a way to use transaction without annotation with read-only is true and also with rollback for exception class? I don't understand the question. Because you're setting read-only to true and rollback to an exception class, which are both attributes of the transaction annotation used in Spring. So why not use that annotation? I don't understand the question. So yeah, Vishal, if you can explain that differently, I'm happy to take another look at it. Okay, one more question about ID generation via sequence for an Oracle database. I had an ID collision, unique constraint violation. It was fixed by setting allocation size to 1 in sequence generator. Why may it happen? Why may it happen? Well, that's hard to answer without knowing your actual table model and more information about the persistence layer. What could have happened is, and that was a common issue with Hibernate versions older than, well, I think it was a 5.2 or 5.3. So in these older versions, Hibernate didn't check if the allocation size configured on the sequence generator annotation matched the step size or the increment size on your database sequence. And what happened then quite often was the database sequence was set to an increment of 1, and Hibernate's sequence was set to an increment of 50. And what happens then is Hibernate requests a value from the sequence, gets 1 for example, and thinks, okay, we have a step size of 50. I can increment this 49 times. So Hibernate gets value 1 and then counts 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on until 50. And then Hibernate requests the next value from the sequence and expects to get a value that's at least 51 or higher. If you then have an increment size of 1 on your database sequence, then the database will return with 2. So then Hibernate takes that value and thinks, okay, value 2, I can increment it 49 times. The next record that gets inserted gets that value that Hibernate got from the sequence, which is 2. And this then creates an ID collision. You can create the same issue sooner if you're using multiple application instances in parallel, or if you shut down your application in between. So everything that creates another select next file from your sequence will run into that issue. And the cause for that is that you have a mismatch between your sequence configuration and your sequence generator configuration. You need to make sure that the allocation size and the increment size of the sequence are the same. In current Hibernate versions, this gets validated at startup. So there your deployment will fail if Hibernate recognizes an allocation size of 50 configured for the association for the sequence generator, which is the default for the sequence generator annotation. So where did I start? Yeah, you get an exception, and the deployment fails if these two values don't match each other. Okay, so Vishal wrote, the problem I'm facing is, so we're talking about the transactional issue. The validation message is not thrown to the client as I'm getting only transaction failed message. I had to traverse to the root cause to extract the constraint exception. Yeah, but that's an issue of the transaction handling between your backend and the client. So yeah, to provide more input on that, we would need to talk about the technology that you're using to implement your API and a bunch of other things. So yeah, my recommendation there would be make sure that the exception gets automatically mapped to a meaningful error message. And that quite often then depends on your either REST implementation, or if you're using remote calls, then it shouldn't be a big deal because you already got the exception class there. Okay. So we have 10 minutes left before I need to leave and get on a different call. Let's try to answer 1 or 2 more comments here on YouTube, and if you have a question that I could answer, then please post it in the chat, and then we will end this in about 10 minutes. Let's switch to this view again. Okay, so here we have a video on implementing a custom sequence-based ID generator, and okay, we have a custom sequence-based ID generator, and Ryan wants to use it for non-ID fields. Well, that's a common question. Unfortunately, you can't do that. Hi Ryan. The JPA specification only supports generators for ID fields. Can't use them for So what could you do instead? There's not a lot you can do instead. One thing you could do instead is to use a database trigger and Hibernate's generated value annotation to fetch the updated value after it was made by the trigger. And we probably have a tip about that. Yeah, no, that generated. Yes, that's the. Explain that here. No. Here. So yeah, let's take a quick look at the article. What you can do is you can use oh damn, it's a generated annotation. I'm mixing these two up way too often. It's just good that IDEs find that quite easily. Okay. So what you can do is you can annotate an attribute with generated. It's one of Hibernate's annotations. And you can then specify when this value gets generated by the database. It's either on insert or always, which is insert and update. And Hibernate then, and you can see that down here, triggers another select statement after it updated that entity. So Hibernate knows when executing this update statement, then a database trigger will fire and change that that value that's the database field that's mapped by this attribute, and then Hibernate selects only that attribute or the database column from the database with another query, which is quite nice, but still an overhead because you now have a select statement after each update, which from a performance point of view isn't great. Okay, how can I persist an entity with all its child entities? Ah, yeah, here we are talking about cascading of write operations. First, I want to create authors. In future, when they write books, records must be inserted into the book table and book author table. What should be the cascade type in both the author and book entities? Well, you don't need any cascading here, right? I mean, you're just persisting the book entities. Cascading for this use case. We need persist the book entities and add them to the association on the author entity. Okay, API design. Don't expose your JPA entities in your REST API. Yeah, that's something that I think is an often overlooked thing. Yes, entities are projos. Yes, entities can be easily serialized into JSON documents, but you shouldn't do that. Entities represent your domain model used internally in your service, and they represent the at least to some extent the table model, and these are implementation details, and you shouldn't share implementation details and expose them on the entity level. That's from an architectural point just a smell and a really bad practice because it makes it really hard to evolve your front end and your table model independently of each other, and the risk that you expose something that you don't want to expose to the client is pretty high, and the risk that a change in your API affects the table model is also pretty high, and these are all things you don't want to do. Okay, do you have or could record a video that shows an example of how to use entity to DTO and DTO to entity model? Thanks for the good work. Okay. Yes, I have something about that. Pretty sure. DTO. Yeah. I'm explaining the different projections here. In general, you should use DTOs for all read operations and entities only for write operations if your write operation returns the written data to the client. Then you need to decide if you map the entity to DTO programmatically, or if you use a query, or if you fetch the DTO using a query. And that entirely depends on the amount of data and the use case. Okay. I think it's about the cascade question that I just answered. He thinks cascading should happen only within aggregates, never across aggregates. Yeah, I highly agree with that. So an aggregate is an aggregate as defined in domain-driven design. So it's basically a group of entities that that belong together, like in order with its order positions, or maybe a book and its reviews and stuff like that. So there you have a clear parent-child association between your database tables, the records in them, and your entities. And within such a parent-child association, it makes sense to cascade the operation from parent to child. But with authors and books, you most likely don't have one aggregate. These are probably two independent aggregates, especially because there's a many-to-many association between them. So using cascading there doesn't really make sense in general, and especially not for the use case that was mentioned there, where we are just adding new books to the system. Okay, so I would say we end the stream here. I would like to ask you to let me know how this stream was for you, if everything went smoothly or not. As I said, this is the first time that I used a tool called Restream to stream to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter at the same time. And that's something where, at least on my end, I definitely need to get used to. But well, if we can distribute the stream easily, then why not do that? So yeah, thanks for joining. I will be back tomorrow with the video on YouTube, and then there will be a new post, a video, and a live stream next week as usual. Post on Tuesday, live stream on Wednesday, and a video on Thursday. So yeah, thanks for joining. Have a great afternoon, and we will see each other again hopefully next week.